much. I'm delighted to be here. Yeah, I'll just get going. In a short and dense passage in Metaphysics Gamma 7, Aristotle famously defines truth and falsity. I say famously because these two lines of Greek text are commonly seen to contain the foundations of Aristotle's correspondence theory of truth, and the passage has been referred to by numerous interpreters ever since. It is a genuine locus classicus. Not only do I mean scholars of ancient philosophy and commentators, ancient, medieval, and modern, but also scholars of analytical philosophy, especially those working in the fields of the philosophy of language, philosophical logic, and ontology. Probably the most famous example of a modern scholar working with Aristotle's definitions is the founder of the so-called semantic conception of truth and the originator of the T-scheme, Alfred Tarski, who has sparked a long-standing debate on whether or not the notions of truth and falsity are definable, and if so, for which purposes. Tarski was explicit about his goal to base his theory on Aristotle's intuitions regarding truth and falsity. However, the growing interest in these definitions has not contributed to an adequate understanding of them, or at least so will I argue. In this paper, I will provide reasons for why the most widespread and authoritative interpretation of Aristotle's definitions should be rejected. Instead, I will propose an interpretation that displays the fundamental link between the propositional and the ontological level, which Aristotle's definitions suggest. The merits of my proposal consist first and foremost in a better understanding of Aristotle's definitions of truth and falsity. Besides, my approach has the prospect of sparking off new discussions on how to understand Aristotle's correspondence theory of truth more generally, and how the interface between Aristotle's philosophy of language, logic, and ontology looks like. My paper falls into three sections. First, I will introduce Aristotle's definitions and supply a first analysis. Then I will briefly discuss the dominant interpretation and explain why it should be rejected. In the third and final section, I will expound my own approach. Section 1, Aristotle's definitions. Aristotle defines truth and falsity as follows. For to assert of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is false. And to assert of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, is true. Now let me give you a few moments to digest these lines. I have a sip of tea. Aristotle lists two conditions for something to qualify as false: to assert of what is that it is not, and to assert of what is not that it is. Similarly, he lists two conditions for something to qualify as true: to assert of what is that it is, and to assert of what is not that it is not. Each condition is sufficient for something to qualify as false or true. Hence, both definitions have disjunctive form. We may restate these two definitions as follows. TDF, to assert of what is that it is, or to assert of what is not that it is not, is true. And FDF, to assert of what is that it is not, or to assert of what is not that it is false. The first thing to note is that the verb to assert occurring in the definientia indicates that we are dealing with propositional truth and falsity. The truth bearers relevant in the immediate context are propositions, which in turn are either utterances or beliefs. Next, Aristotle's diction has to be understood generically, since otherwise the above definitions could hardly qualify as such. The generic expressions are what is toon, what is not, to meon, and to assert ... that ... which is in Greek the phrase to lege plus substantive plus verb. Thus, Aristotle's definitions relate to whatever is not, and to anything that asserts something or something else in the way it is laid down in the definitions. The third expression represents a three-place verbal phrase of the form X asserts of Y that Z, where X is something or maybe someone that asserts something of something else, namely a proposition or maybe an epistemic subject. Y stands for what is or what is not, and Z stands for either of the phrases it is or it is not. I will further specify the latter two constituents of the assertion phrase in the third section. One thing to note is that the subject position of the assertion phrase, X, is covered in Aristotle's definitions, given the infinitive constructions. What exactly does the truth or falsity predicate apply to? There are at least two construals. On the first truth condition may be rephrased as follows. If X asserts of what is that it is, X is true. The drawback of this construal consists in the fact that only propositions, not epistemic subjects, satisfy X. Otherwise, epistemic subjects would be truth bearers. On the second construal, the first truth condition may be rephrased as follows. If X asserts of what is that it is, the result of X's asserting of what is that it is true. In this case, either propositions or epistemic subjects satisfy X, and the truth predicate attaches to a fully formed assertion. The drawback of this construal consists in the fact that the consequent appears to introduce a new, distinct referent. Nevertheless, I find both construals plausible and do not want to decide for one and against another. Next, we have to specify the sense of the is occurring twice per condition for truth and for falsity. Interpreters usually distinguish between the following three senses. First, veridical being is in the sense of is the case. Second, predicative being is in the sense of is F, where F is elliptically omitted in the definitions. And third, existential being is in the sense of exists. Here is the first truth condition rephrased according to each of these interpretations. VB, veridical being, to assert of what is the case that it is the case, is true. PB, predicative being, to assert of what is F that it is F, is true. And EB, existential being, to assert of what exists that it exists, is true. According to the dominant view, all occurrences of is in the definientia are to be interpreted as instances of veridical being. In what follows, I shall present arguments against the veridical and for a comprehensive, that is, a jointly existential and predicative interpretation. Section 2, the veridical interpretation and its discontents. There are different ways of spelling out an interpretation of Aristotle's definitions in terms of veridical being as in VB above. For example, one could maintain that the phrase following VB is interpreted as follows. To assert of what is true that it is true is true. In this case, one would interpret being the case in terms of being true. Even though this rendering is viciously circular, one might contend that Aristotle's definitions do not allow for any other interpretation than a viciously circular one. I do not believe that such a view is Aristotelian, though. One could also try to salvage the veridical interpretation if one reduces propositional truth to ontological truth. In this case, VB may be rephrased as follows. To assert of a true substrate or a true state of affairs that it is true, i.e. that it is as it is true. The attempt to attribute to Aristotle a theory of ontological truth and falsity has been met with suspicion and open criticism, and rightly so, because the evidence for this theory is scanty, provided that the relevant passages in the Aristotelian corpus are read that way for that matter. I myself, like others, do not believe that the textual evidence is sufficient to attribute the theory of ontological truth and falsity to Aristotle. Besides, Aristotle explicitly says that the locus of truth and falsity is the intellectual faculty of the soul, De Anima 3.6, and that truth and falsity are not to be found in things, but instead in discursive thinking, Metaphysics 8.4. I therefore reject this alternative approach. Other ways of spelling out the veridical interpretation are the following two. To assert of what in fact is, that it in fact is true. And to assert of what is as it is, that it is as it is true. These construals are dissatisfying because they are hardly informative. They leave open what exactly is asserted of what else, and how and why the result of asserting something of something else yields something true or false. But then, why would one opt for the veridical interpretation of Aristotle's definitions in the first place? There are two strong reasons in favor of this reading. First, the veridical interpretation might be expressive enough to cover all truths and falsities. Aristotle's definitions should meet the condition of being sufficiently general so as to apply to all propositional truth-bearers. Otherwise, there is reason to deny them their status as definitions. Second, the predicative interpretation under PB and the existential interpretation under EB are too narrow to be sufficiently general if each is taken by itself. The existential interpretation does not cover predicative being, or PB, and the predicative interpretation does not cover existential being, or EB. We may come up with at least three objections to these two claims. First of all, we may want to ask how exactly Aristotle's definitions apply to propositions such as Socrates is rational or no human is mortal. How do we determine the truth values of these two propositions and, in fact, all other truth-evaluable propositions if Aristotle's definitions are read veridically? Such an account seems to be missing, and the claim that the veridical interpretation covers all truths and falsities is in need of substantiation. Secondly, the fact that the predicative and the existential interpretation, each taken singly, is not sufficiently general has the prospect of being sufficiently general if taken together. In fact, this is exactly how I shall spell out my approach in the next section. Thirdly, a striking feature of the veridical interpretation is the idea that one may account for Aristotelian truth and falsity without acknowledging the fundamental status of the technical notions of combination synthesis and separation dihyresis, which frequently figure when Aristotle characterizes truth and falsity. I will shed light on some of these passages in the next section, and I will take it for granted that Aristotle's definitions cannot be properly understood without the notions of combination and separation. To sum up, I believe there is a way of fulfilling the constraint of Aristotle's definitions being fully general without subscribing to the veridical reading. I hold that the veridical interpretation is not attractive. It is hardly informative, if not viciously circular, or it relies on a questionable theory of ontological truth and falsity. Even the reasons why one should subscribe to this interpretation may be dispelled. In what follows, I will propose an alternative way of interpreting Aristotle's definitions, which is informative, non-circular, and accommodates insights into Aristotelian truth and falsity drawn from other relevant passages. Section 3, the comprehensive interpretation, a logico-ontological approach. As far as I can see, those in favor of the veridical interpretation fail to notice that the immediate context gives us a hint as to how the definitions ought to be understood. Only 2 lines before stating the definitions, Aristotle states the principle of excluded middle, which says, start of quote, "It is necessary to affirm or to deny any one thing of one thing," end of quote. Aristotle goes on to claim that this principle, or its validity, becomes clear after defining truth and falsity. Only a few lines after stating the definitions in turn, Aristotle explains that, start of quote, "Discursive thinking affirms or denies every discursive or intuitive thought whenever it asserts something true or false. This is clear from the definition. Whenever it combines this way in an affirmation or denial, it asserts something true. And whenever it combines that way, it asserts something false," end of quote. Both passages suggest that Aristotle's definitions involve some sort of affirming or denying something. T3, the passage we are seeing in front of us, refers to a definition, and it is clear from the context and the content of the passage that Aristotle refers to his definitions of truth and falsity. We are told in T3 that discursive thinking asserts something true or false in an affirmation or denial if it combines this or that way. Now, the problem is that Aristotle's definitions are silent about combining, affirming, and denying. However, we can supply the relevant information from other Aristotelian texts and by subjecting the definitions to further scrutiny. The definitions indicate what has to be affirmed or denied of what else in order for the resultant proposition to qualify as either true or false. For instance, the first truth condition says something is true if it asserts of what is that it is. To assert that something is amounts to affirming something. The resultant proposition is an affirmation. The second truth condition says something is true if it asserts of what is not that it is not. To assert that something is not amounts to denying something. The resultant proposition is a denial. This construal accounts for the third component of the assertion phrase X asserts of Y that Z, which makes up both definitions. Z may be replaced by either of the phrases it is or it is not. The former, i.e. it is, yields an affirmation. The latter, it is not, yields a denial. Thus, affirmations and denials satisfy the affirmative assertion phrase, provided that the variables are replaced by the appropriate complements. This is so because affirmations as well as denials assert something, albeit in different ways. Affirmations assert that something is, denials assert that something is not. As for the Y in the assertion phrase, and for the technical term of combining, let us take a look at the following 2 passages. Start of quote. For on the one hand, truth has the affirmation in the case of what is combined and the denial in the case of what is separated. Falsity, on the other hand, has the contradictory of this apportionment. End of quote. And next, start of quote, that person asserts something true who thinks what is separated to be separated and what is combined to be combined. And that person is in error who is in a state opposite to the things. End of quote. Without going into the details of these two passages, we should note that according to Aristotle, truth evaluable affirmations and denials concern things combined or separated. T5, the present passage, applies the terminology of combination and separation to the operations in thinking, as well as to the things they relate to. Accordingly, I will distinguish between logical combination and separation, referring to the operations of affirming and denying, and ontological combination and separation, referring to the state of the things affirmations and denials are about. My own approach, which I dub logico-ontological, is based on this fundamental structural analogy between ontological and logical combination and separation. Now, what are things combined and separated? And what exactly is the propositional counterpart to combination and separation? For Aristotle, things combined are things that are and unities or ontological units, and things separated are things that are not and pluralities. The two basic constituents in Aristotle's ontology are substrates and their attributes. If an attribute coincides with a substrate, for example, being rational with Socrates, the composite is a thing combined or an ontological unit or unity. And if an attribute does not coincide with the substrate, there is no composite, but instead an ontological plurality because the items in question are separated. If the substrate, the attribute, or both do not exist, there cannot be a coincidence, as for example, being a wizard in Harry Potter. Substrates, in turn, may be analyzed as things combined. For instance, the individual Socrates is a combined thing if the human form is combined with Socrates' matter, namely when he is alive, and Socrates is no combined thing if the human form is separated from Socrates' matter, namely when he is dead, a typical tenet of Aristotle's hylomorphism. In a way, affirmations and denials mimic these two ontological configurations of combination and separation. Existential affirmations assert that the substrate is combined, and existential denials assert that the substrate is separated. Predicative affirmations assert that an attribute is combined with a substrate, and predicative denials assert that an attribute is separated from a substrate. Examples are Socrates exists, Socrates does not exist, Socrates is rational, Socrates is not rational. Further, existential and predicative propositions are the only two proposition types Aristotle acknowledges. We are now in a position to determine the second constituent of the assertion phrase, X asserts of Y that Z. The two eligible complements mentioned above were what is and what is not. And what is stands for a thing combined, i.e. an ontological unit, namely a substrate or a substrate attribute composite. And what is not stands for a thing separated, i.e. an ontological plurality or a thing that is not. With these preliminaries in mind, let us proceed to the comprehensive interpretation of Aristotle's definitions. Few scholars have adopted this view, And what is still missing is an account as to how, if at all, the comprehensive interpretation covers all truth and falsities. On the comprehensive interpretation, Aristotle's definitions may be restated as follows. TDF star, to assert of what is F, that it is F, or to assert of what is not F, that it is not F, is true. And FDF star, to assert of what is F, that it is not F, or to assert of what is not F, that it is F, is false. These definitions apply to predicative propositions and to substrate attribute composites if F is expressed. And they apply to existential propositions and to substrates if F is not expressed. What guarantees that the proposition type, i.e. existential or predicative, is correctly assigned the corresponding ontological correlate, i.e. substrate or substrate attribute composite, is the syntactic parallelism in the definitions. The fact that Aristotle's definitions are indeterminate as to whether they involve existential or predicative being merely underpins their schematic character. The propositions satisfying the definitions have to be so specified, not the definitions. Apart from existential and predicative propositions, the definitions also accommodate affirmative and negative propositions. But what about, say, quantified and modal propositions? For example, how do the definitions apply to propositions such as no human is mortal, or some plants necessarily are alive? This is where Aristotle's logical syntax significantly deviates from the modern analysis. For Aristotle, affirmations and denials are atomic propositions, and all propositions either implicitly or explicitly involve the copula is if affirmative, or the copula is not if negative. All other formal properties, such as universal or particular quantification, or modalities like necessity or possibility, merely modify the copula and are no independent intentional operators as in modern logic. Hence, Aristotle's definitions only involve the most fundamental distinction between propositions, namely that between affirmative and negative propositions. All other formal properties are modifications of the affirmative or negative copula, and the two proposition types, existential and predicative, are accommodated in virtue of the definition's indeterminacy as to whether they express existential or predicative being. I will conclude this section by briefly characterizing Aristotle's theory of truth and falsity, and by determining the truth values of three sample propositions. Even though propositions and the things propositions are about are rather distinct entities, the propositional level may, as it were, approximate the ontological level in terms of specification. I hold that for Aristotle, the ontological level is always more specified in terms of specification. If the propositional level matches the ontological level in a sufficiently correct way, the proposition is true and false otherwise. By matching in a sufficiently correct way, I mean that for a proposition to be true, it is sufficient for it to match only those ontological properties which have a formal counterpart in the proposition. Hence, on my account, Aristotle's theory of truth and falsity is a qualified correspondence theory of truth and falsity. Qualified to the effect that there can never be full but only sufficient correspondence. Here are three examples. Number one, Socrates is rational. This affirmation asserts the combination of the predicate rational with a subject, Socrates. However, this logical combination does not distinguish between accidental and essential ontological combination. It is part of Socrates' essence to be rational, and this is not expressed by the proposition. Nevertheless, if we assume that Socrates exists, the proposition is true because it states the underlying ontological configuration in a sufficiently correct way. Since what is essentially rational is rational, to assert of what is essentially rational, that it is rational, is true. Our sample affirmation would express something closer to the ontological level if it stated the necessity of Socrates as being rational. But since the affirmation is no necessity proposition, it matches the ontological level to that extent in which a non-modal proposition may express something true about essential combinations. Number 2, no human is mortal. This denial asserts the universal separation of the predicate mortal from the subject human. This proposition is false because there are humans that are mortal. The denial states of what is mortal that it is not mortal. Hence, the proposition does not match the underlying ontological level. And number 3, some plants necessarily are alive. This affirmation asserts the non-universal necessary combination of the predicate alive with the subject plants. This proposition is true because if something is a plant, it is essentially alive. The affirmation states of what is essentially alive that it is necessarily alive. Although this sample affirmation would express something closer to the ontological level if it stated that all plants are necessarily alive, the proposition is nevertheless true because it states the underlying ontological configuration in a sufficiently correct way. Conclusion. In this paper, I have subjected Aristotle's definitions of truth and falsity to an analysis. I have argued against the dominant veridical interpretation and for a comprehensive, that is, a jointly existential and predicative interpretation. I have proposed a logico-ontological approach to Aristotle's definitions by basing my discussion on the fundamental structural analogy between logical and ontological combination and separation. Logical combination and separation relate to the operations of affirming and denying, ontological combination and separation to unities and pluralities. I have tried to show that the comprehensive interpretation fulfills the condition of making Aristotle's definitions cover all truths and falsities by reducing all truth-evaluable Aristotelian propositions to the two proposition types, existential and predicative, and to affirmations and denials, which Aristotle's definitions on the comprehensive reading accommodate. I have claimed that if the propositional level matches the ontological level in a sufficiently correct way, the proposition is true, otherwise false. Thank you for your attention.